Amid all the news emanating from Ukraine, you'd be forgiven for having already forgotten President Zelensky's bombshell announcement. On Thursday, October the 17th, the Ukrainian leader spoke at the European Council summit in Brussels. His remarks covered a lot of ground, but the standout quote was this: "Either Ukraine will have nuclear weapons, and that will be our protection, or we shall have some sort of alliance. Apart from NATO, today we do not know any effective alliances." In other words, it seemed to a whole lot of people like Zelensky was threatening to acquire the bomb. Now, to be clear, these comments were later rowed back, with the official Ukrainian position being that Zelensky was merely emphasizing how much Kyiv needs NATO. In his words, "We are not building nuclear weapons. What I meant is that today there is no stronger security guarantee for us besides NATO membership." Nor did the story stay in the headlines for long. Just days later, news broke that North Korea was sending thousands of troops to fight for Russia, and in the political maelstrom that followed, the Ukrainian nuke story was quickly forgotten. And yet there's something more to this than just a flurry of headlines, something that requires deeper analysis. Not only because Zelensky isn't alone in hinting that Kyiv could get the bomb, but also because the whole debate ties into a vital part of both Ukraine's history and the wider narrative of this war. After all, Ukraine was once a nuclear weapons state, and the fact that it willingly gave those weapons up is often portrayed as key to understanding whether Russia's full-scale invasion could have been prevented. The Nuclear Threat Initiative explains how, quote, "Ever since Russia began its brutal invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, public and political discourse about the role of nuclear weapons has been divided. While some argue that Vladimir Putin would never have dared to invade the country if Ukraine had held on to its nuclear arsenal, others emphasize that the weapons located on Ukraine's territory were never Ukraine's to give up in the first place." The quote ends. As we're about to see, though, the truth is more complicated. As with the idea that Kyiv may seek nuke in the modern era, nothing is as black or white as some would have you believe. To understand why, we need to briefly travel back to the last days of the Soviet Union. In this era, Ukraine was an industrial powerhouse. Vast ships were built in its dockyards. Enormous nuclear power plants were constructed to feed its demand for energy. In what is today the city of Dnipro, the RS-20 intercontinental ballistic missiles used to carry Soviet nuclear warheads were manufactured, with the control systems made a short distance away in Kharkiv. This meant that the nukes stationed in Ukraine by the Soviets were designed to be sat atop locally manufactured missiles. And boy, were there a lot of nukes. At the time of the USSR's collapse, there were more nuclear weapons stationed in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic than almost anywhere else in the empire. Commonly, it's stated that Ukraine's arsenal at independence was the third largest in the world, after those of America and post-Soviet Russia, but the Nuclear Threat Initiative claims that Ukraine held, quote, "a majority of all strategic nuclear warheads," a technical term for the non-tactical, city-destroying bombs of humanity's nightmares. The next part of the story you might know already. Under pressure from the US, which was worried about proliferation, Kyiv agreed to voluntarily surrender its nukes and transfer them to Russia. In return, the Ukrainians got something called the Budapest Memorandum. Signed in 1994, the memorandum was basically a joint declaration in which the US, UK, and Russia all offered Kyiv security assurances while pledging to respect its borders and avoid using military or economic coercion against it. Now, since you're watching this on a war-focused channel, you're already aware of what came next. 2 decades after the memorandum was signed, Russia annexed Crimea and invaded the Donbass. Washington and London, meanwhile, basically kinda just shrugged. This is the historical tale that has come to dominate narratives of the war. The story that was undoubtedly in Zelensky's mind as he spoke at the European Council summit. Here's how he explained the impact of the memorandum to delegates. Who gave up their nuclear weapons? All of them. Only Ukraine. Who is fighting today? Ukraine. Now, this isn't strictly true. Kazakhstan and Belarus also had smaller nuclear arsenals stationed on their territory, which they likewise gave up in exchange for their own Budapest memoranda. And while Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko may have transformed his nation into a willing Russian doormat, it's hard to argue that either country has been invaded. Nor has South Africa, which terminated its own nuclear weapons program in the early 1990s, having already assembled 6 working devices. Still, Zelensky's point isn't to dig into the weeds of history, but to suggest that Moscow would have never dared launch its full-scale invasion if Kyiv had the bomb. In this, he's ironically backed by the Kremlin's own behavior. Since the war began, Vladimir Putin has rattled the nuclear saber so many times that he resembles nothing so much as bears waving a pair of plutonium maracas. In autumn of 2022, recent troops showed that US intelligence believed the threat of the Kremlin using a tactical nuke was as high as 50%. More recently, Moscow altered its nuclear doctrine to allow their use in case of a massive air attack on Russia, or, and we're quoting the Washington Post here, a conventional attack on Russia by a non-nuclear nation that is supported by a nuclear power. For many, these threats are the precise reason why the war is still ongoing today, and Western powers remain squeamish about getting directly involved, even as North Korea appears to be entering the war. Speaking last year to the Belfer Center about the power of Putin's threats, nuclear proliferation researcher Mariana Buzyan noted how, quote, "The war offers evidence to support the view that nuclear deterrence, the use of nuclear threats, works. Russian nuclear threats and the existence of nuclear weapons in Russia, its willingness to conjure them up in a war, seems to have worked to restrain the conflict and has induced caution in Western support." The quote ends. If this is your understanding of history and modern deterrence, then of course it would make total sense for Kiev to now want the bomb. After all, the whole of Ukraine has seen how even Putin has been careful not to expand the war onto the territory of Poland or the Baltic states, presumably out of fear of NATO's nuclear umbrella. In this scenario, the 1994 Budapest memorandum and the broken promises that followed is the original sin from which everything else flows. Yet, this reading of history may not be strictly accurate, and it's important that we understand why, since the popular telling outlined earlier is clearly still influencing many in Kiev. The first thing to note is that Ukraine in 1991 didn't suddenly become a nuclear state like America with a vast stockpile of weapons and the ability to launch them at will. Here's how the Nuclear Threat Initiative explains things. The government in Kiev had neither operational control of the weapons nor a nuclear fuel cycle necessary to sustain a fully independent nuclear weapons program. What Ukraine gave up was therefore not a full-fledged nuclear deterrent, but at most a nuclear option. A good modern-day analogy might be the European nations that house American nukes. Italy, Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands, as well as the part-European nation of Turkey, together hold roughly 100 tactical nuclear weapons designed to be carried and dropped by European air forces. Crucially, though, the ability to access or use these nukes belongs to Washington and Washington alone. Without Uncle Sam's authorization, these bombs are just expensive paperweights. This was Ukraine's position in 1991. The nukes may have been on Ukraine's territory, but the ability to launch them was firmly with Moscow. Now, that doesn't mean that Ukraine had no choice but to turn over its warheads. We already mentioned how the newly independent nation had a deep pool of scientific talent in its nuclear plants and aerospace industries. If the decision had been made to pursue nuclear weapons as a deterrent, the know-how was likely already there. That Ukraine has this knowledge is something Zelensky's officials have tried to impress upon Western nations. Shortly before the European Council summit, German tabloid Bild carried a bombshell article in which an anonymous high-ranking Ukrainian official declared, "We have the material, we have the knowledge. If the order is given, we will only need a few weeks to have the first bomb." The reaction to this article was so negative that others quickly went on record to pour cold water on the idea. Speaking to Ukrainian network TCH, Reserve Colonel of the Ukrainian Armed Forces Petro Chernik noted that developing nuclear weapons is a highly complex process. After all, plutonium, which is used to create such weapons, is very difficult to obtain. Ukraine does not have the technology to produce nuclear warheads. Back in the 1990s, however, it was a different game. Yet, that's not to say that Kiev wouldn't have been wise to get the bomb. The outside pressure to halt the program would have been immense, not least from the USA. And Ukraine in the 1990s was in the middle of an economic catastrophe. Here's how a Carnegie Endowment described things. Ukraine's economy contracted annually between 9.7 and 22.7% in 1991 to 1996. The country experienced hyperinflation and an exceptionally huge production decline for a country not ravaged by a major war. Official GDP collapsed by almost half from 1990 to 1994. Economic growth would not resume again until 2000. End quote. Choosing to pursue nuclear weapons against such a dark economic backdrop would have invited sanctions and isolations that would have only made things worse. In effect, while Kiev probably could have built its own independent nuclear deterrent in the 1990s, it would have done so at the expense of becoming Europe's North Korea, a state that prioritized weapons of mass destruction over feeding its starving people. Seen from this perspective, the idea of Kiev holding onto its nukes in 1994 begins to look less like the path not taken and more like fantasy. In all honesty, there probably isn't any universe out there in which Ukraine in February of 2022 is both a vibrant democratic state and also armed with enough nukes to make Putin back off. And this is really important because the fantasy is what people implicitly believe when they call the surrender of Ukraine's nukes a mistake. A fantasy in which the awful economic and political trade-offs holding on to the nukes would have forced are forgotten. Sadly, it's this fantasy that likewise seems to animate talks of a modern-day nuclear weapons program. For all it's tempting to see nukes as a panacea for Ukraine's current predicament, the simple truth is that sprinting for the bomb today would have all sorts of destabilizing side effects. In his interview with TCH's Canal 24, Petro Chernik pointed out that if Ukraine started producing nuclear weapons now, quote, the information would spread, and there is no doubt that our allies would prohibit such activity. As soon as it becomes an objective reality, we will immediately be prevented by everyone. There's also the obvious issue of Russia's reaction. Vladimir Putin told a press conference the day after Zelensky's comments that regarding a nuclear Ukraine, Russia will not allow this to happen no matter what. Now, you could argue that since Moscow is already destroying entire Ukrainian cities in the Donbass and bombing children's hospitals in the rest of the country, there are no escalatory steps left that the Kremlin could take. But this, of course, ignores the reality of Russia's own weapons of mass destruction. At the moment, Russia holds something like 5,580 nuclear warheads, slightly more than the United States. All reporting about how the Kremlin toyed with dropping a nuke in the autumn of 2022 stresses that a major reason Putin didn't go through with it is because China told him not to. Were Beijing presented with irrefutable evidence that Ukraine was racing for the bomb, would Xi Jinping still tell Putin he had to stay his hand? These are obviously questions that none of us have the answer to, but they do suggest that today, as in 1994, Kiev's room for maneuver on this issue is far more constrained than people think. Nor is it clear that swiftly assembling a viable device would make Ukraine suddenly impervious to attack. After all, if you want an example of a nuclear-armed state being invaded and its citizens massacred, look no further than what happened in Israel on October 7th, 2023. Depressing as it may be then, the truth is that nukes were never likely a serious option for Ukraine in the 1990s and are even less so today. Instead, the best way to guarantee the country's continued security after the war ends is most probably by doing what Zelensky suggested in his recent peace plan: have Ukraine join NATO. Failing that, a decent backup might be what the BBC euphemistically called containment of Russia via a non-nuclear strategic deterrent package deployed on Ukrainian soil. A phrase which, in lay-speak, basically means equip Ukraine with enough long-range missiles to blow up power stations and infrastructure in Moscow, to respond to Putin attacking a children's hospital in Kiev by destroying a military command center in St. Petersburg, all while it's full of officers. The ability, in short, to return Russia's punches. Sadly for the wider world, this is unlikely to be the lesson that other countries with expansionist neighbors take from the conflict. Instead, many are likely to ignore the subtleties of the 1994 surrender of Ukraine's nukes and determine that building the bomb might be their only way forwards. As Mariana Bujarin told the Belfer Center in her interview, the optics of the situation are simply awful for nuclear non-proliferation. To say that, well, the country had a nuclear option, it gave up nuclear weapons, transferred them to Russia, only 25 years later to be invaded by that country under the shadow of nuclear threats to prevent assistance to Ukraine. These optics suggest very unfavorable lessons for nuclear non-proliferation. The quote ends. Nukes may not be the magic answer Ukraine is seeking, but it may be that Russia's continued invasion convinces other states, from South Korea to Saudi Arabia, to seek security with the bomb, and that could have devastating consequences for the entire world.